It is my distinct honor to welcome to DePaul University Dr. Lee. I first met Dr. Lee back, I think it was in 2002, when we were both working on our dissertations, trying to finish up our PhDs in religious studies and theology, respectively. And we've been friends and colleagues ever since. So this is a real treat for me to bring Dr. Lee to this class in particular, because he's been thinking a lot about Latino spirituality. He's been thinking a lot about liberation theology in particular, and its relevance to U.S. Latinos in this country today. So just a little bit of background on Dr. Lee. He is Associate Professor of Systematic Theology at Fordham University, which is in the Bronx. He has written a wonderful book on Ignacio Ellacuría, and the title of this book is called Bearing the Weight of Salvation. This book looks at Ignacio Ellacuría's philosophical and theological work, and we will discover later in the quarter we've had a little bit on liberation theology, but Ignacio Ellacuría is one of the main voices of Latin American liberation theology, and he was martyred in 1989 because of the kind of work, intellectual work, that he was so engaged in. So Michael Lee has presented a wonderful book on Ignacio Ellacuría. Dr. Lee also teaches courses in liberation theology, Christology, and spirituality at Fordham University. And he currently serves on the board of directors for both the Catholic Theological Society of America, the CTSA, as well as the Academy of Catholic Hispanic Theologians of the United States. That acronym is ACTUS. He lives in the Bronx, New York, with his wife Natalia, a beautiful person, and his two sons, William and Benjamin. I've only met William. I've yet to meet, I don't think I've met Benjamin, so I look forward to that day. But without any further ado, it is my distinct honor and privilege to welcome Dr. Lee, and I hope we can all give him a rousing
Thank you very much, and thank you to the Center for World Catholicism for inviting me to participate in the sessions that are going on these next few days, and to reflect upon Catholicism around the globe, spirituality. You know, to be in Chicago or in New York, where I'm living, the globe is represented immediately in our own school, in our city blocks. Truly, we have a global community. As a way to get over that initial hurdle, as your eyes are upon me, let me put forward three people. Person A, born in New York, both parents are from Puerto Rico, raised in the United States, doesn't speak much Spanish really at all. Although recently has come to marry a native Puerto Rican and fluent Spanish speaker, so is growing in that country. Person B, one parent from Puerto Rico, the other one from Suriname, grew up with some facility in Spanish and English. Finally, the last one, both parents are from Puerto Rico. In fact, spent a good deal of their childhood in Puerto Rico, and so living here negotiates both of those. So, who is the Hispanic? Who is the Latino or Latina? Well, hopefully the answer is all three. Person A is Jennifer Lopez. Person B, Jimmy Smith. And person C, me. Unlikely in that trio, she said. And yet that is the story of U.S. Latinos and Latinas. That heritage mixes. And so parents from different backgrounds, skin color of different types, language skills of varying familiarity in English and in Spanish. And that's part of the story and part of what I wanted to talk about today. My title involves a lot of pieces to talk about Latino spirituality in the next generation. And by spirituality, I mean those sets of practices that are part of the living out of a faith commitment, of one's life, of the value decisions that are made, and the traditions that one is a part of. The word tradition means traditio, to hand on, to pass on. And spiritualities are the way that those things get handed on. Families, communities, in religious traditions. How do spiritualities get formed? How does that tradition, that handing on, take place? Telling stories, be they family stories, biblical stories, of practices, of devotions, different kinds of rituals. And then at the end of the day, as a way of life. It's a way of looking at the world and of moving and being in the world in a particular way. So to talk about a Latino or Latina spirituality is to touch upon all of those things. In doing so, today I'd like to talk a little bit about spirituality. I use the phrase next generation. And by that I mean a couple of things. Number one, that as you look at the U.S. Latino and Latina landscape, that population, you have people who were born in other countries. They are immigrants who come to the United States and are making a way of life here as an encounter between two cultures, one in which they were born and one in which they live in today. But for those in a next generation, born here in the United States, or even the children of those born here in the United States, that negotiation of two cultures is still just as much an issue, but it takes on different complexity, different questions. Things like the negotiation of language, things like identity in relation, sometimes to a home culture that is not known at all. It was interesting for me. I grew up in Miami, Florida, and in high school, many of my classmates were the children of Cuban refugees. And so they were raised with a strong sense of Cuban identity. But unlike myself, they'd never been there. When I spoke of Puerto Rico, I could imagine my grandmother's house and my cousins and places. They only knew Cuba from stories, very powerful and important stories, but negotiating that kind of identity claim is sometimes complex. And for many U.S. Latinos and Latinas, that kind of negotiation goes on constantly. But I mean next generation as well, in terms of theological reflection. I'm a theologian, so I've got to introduce that as well. And that is that we have seen the emergence and the growth of a theology, self-identified as a U.S. Latina theology, which has had powerful reflections, some of which I would like to discuss today. But even there, as the complexity of this next generation and those questions comes to the fore, and new reflections, new ways of thinking about that situation are demanded. And I'd like to talk about some of those today. When thinking about this theological tradition, and even thinking about it globally, one of the central influences has been liberation theology from Latin America. Many of the first founding figures in U.S. Latino and Latina theology have in some way had relationships with Latin American liberation theologians. Orlando Espín studied with Leonardo Hall. Emilio Elizondo's close friendship and relationship for many years with the Peruvian Gustavo Tiares, etc., etc. And so I'd like to talk a little bit about what main points from liberation theology get elaborated or serve as an influence talk a little bit about reflections on Latino and Latina spirituality from this first generation, and then move the story forward and ask about this next generation. Does that sound okay? Good. Well, we're thinking about some of the ideas or characteristics of liberation theology that might be influential here. One of the things is a methodology. See, judge, act. Think about those three terms. See, judge, and act. It's actually a methodology developed in Europe, in France and in Belgium. A kind of reflection in which the first moment, see, involves a looking around at one's situation, observing what context one is living in. It could be negative in terms of what are the problems that one faces, or it could be positive. What are the real possibilities of the present moment? But that serves as a really crucial first moment when thinking about spirituality and the life of faith or theology. To do otherwise would too often fall into just applying just abstract principles and forcing them. A methodology that begins with seeing really asks, what's going on? What is the present life? And from there, in terms of Christian theology, to ask, well, how does one judge this in light of Scripture, in light of tradition? So, judge not in the sense of judgmentalism, but to ask, what do I make of what I see? And for people of faith, what might my faith tell me or inform me about what I see? And then finally, of course, to act. Too often, the notion of being a part of a faith tradition is something in one's mind, a list of things that one assents to. When really it is a way of life, a way of acting, of living, of being in the world. And so, to see, to judge, and to act, and of course, once one acts, one is in a new situation that requires us to see again. So it's a cyclical process. Now, in the context of Latin America, that process meant reflection on the overwhelming reality of poverty, of societies that were unbelievably disconnected in those tiny minorities that took part in the majority of the wealth and prosperity of a nation, and then the masses of those who were suffering. But not only that, that latter group, often exercising a faith that told them, my situation in life, well, it must be God's will. A fatalistic kind of faith that said, well, maybe if I'm good in the next life, I'll receive a kind of reward. But you could see how beginning with this methodology of seeing, judging, and acting, there emerge people, communities, begin to ask, what are the causes of this situation? Why is it my city, my country, looks the way it does? Even to put more concretely, why are there so many children dying of malnutrition in our community? To judge that then, to ask, what does that mean theologically? What does that mean in terms of faith? Is it God's will? Does God say, oh well, good luck? Or does it go against God's will? And if it does that require action, a change? Communities involved in changing these realities. So the See, Judge, Act methodology is so crucial to this liberationist reflection and, as we'll see, to U.S. Latino reflection. A second notion that many liberation theologians have developed that I think has become a powerful notion across the Catholic tradition. Papal encyclicals, the Catholic social teaching tradition have embraced this phrase called the preferential option for the poor. Complicated phrase that needs to be kind of parsed out. Preferential option for the poor. Well, let's start with the last phrase, the poor. Yes, due to that seeing, that looking at the constitution of many Latin American societies, there was an economic emphasis on this notion, the materially poor. But in the years since this insight first came to be, you've seen a widening of reflection of what that term, the poor, could mean. And it just so happens, for instance, in the case of U.S. Latinos and Latinas, a reflection on, for instance, what might cultural marginalization mean like? Racial marginalization look like? Gustavo Gutierrez, liberation theologian from Peru, has said simply, poverty equals death. Death before its time. What are the causes of that death? How might we understand the wider sense of this term, poverty? Option. Not in the sense of optional, but of opting, of acting, of how individuals, especially communities, people of faith, understanding a call to act, to opt, to make a choice, in commitment, in solidarity with those who are poor, or they themselves are poor, to change, to transform the reality in which they live. And then this important term, preferential, often the most controversial of terms. Are we saying that God prefers poor people? I thought God loved everybody. God hate rich people? If you look at the way this term functions, it's not saying that at all. Use the image offered by Dean Brackley, a Jesuit priest who lives and works in El Salvador today. When talking about this term preferential, he says, think about a mother who has a sick child. Now, it's not that she loves her other children any less, right? But that the vulnerable one, maybe at the doorstep of death, calls for something, a specialness of care. That's the sense of preferential option. A sense of not exclusivism, yes, and the others no, but of priority. This one needs attention. Now, the way this gets applied happens at different levels. For instance, the United States Catholic bishops, in their statement on the U.S. economy, talk about when you make an economic decision, any economic decision, ask, what does this mean for the poor? How does this affect those who are poor? Right? So imagine the impact if every road that's built, every stadium that's built, every set of tax laws that are passed and or repealed, asked first, how does this affect? That's the preferential option. The way of understanding this rich but complex phrase. Finally, the last important notion that I wanted to discuss briefly is the notion of praxis, of action. Praxis is the Greek word for action. The 5th book of the New Testament. It's called the Praxis Apostolis, the Acts of the Apostles. what does that mean in the context of what we're talking about? Well, it means two things especially. That we've come to realize that the relationship between our thinking and our acting is not a one-way street. I don't think and understand the world and then I just kind of apply it by living it out. But that in fact, where I'm from affects what I think. How I act shapes how I come to understand things. There's a circularity there in how we think and how we act. And that's a really important concept, as we'll see momentarily. The other dimension is simply that for people of faith traditions, how does it get lived out? A spirituality that embodies this is a crucial question. Right? So once again, we're at the level where beliefs are not simply this list of things I assent to or understand, but it's a way of life. So if we understand these three insights, and I'll do a little piece on the first generation of Latino theology, and then maybe pause for some questions, if that's okay. If we understand these three insights regarding the See, Judge, Act methodology, regarding the preferential option for the poor, and of the importance of praxis, I'd like to turn for a moment to Latino and Latina theology and spirituality that it has reflected on and tried to articulate. And hopefully in turn has influenced. And I'll take as my primary example the work of Father Virgilio Elizondo, whose book called Galilean Journey. And it's a real foundational text. In it, we see Elizondo acting out, kind of demonstrating the See, Judge, Act methodology. And what does he see? He sees something summed up in what he calls mestizaje. This is the notion that U.S. Latinos and Latinas are the products of the encounters of different cultures. He talks about a double encounter in his book. The European meeting, clashing, conquering of a European culture with an indigenous culture here in the Americas. And then a second encounter. Elizondo is Mexican-American, and he writes primarily from that lens. So for him, for instance, this clash of the Europeans and the indigenous means the birth of the Mexican people. But then this, after the United States acquires a huge portion of Mexican land, means the birth of a new people, the Mexican-American people. So a double kind of meeting of cultures. And I want to underscore, this isn't romanticized. This isn't a poetic kind of meeting. Elizondo underscores the painful ways through conquest, domination, marginalization, mestizaje is understood. But even after saying that, Elizondo wants to say that the people that are born in the wake of these cultural meetings, clashes, is a beautiful people with dignity and something special to offer the world. Powerful insight on the part of Elizondo. However, before talking about that contribution, to underscore what he calls the sense of a double rejection. How he experienced, and I think many Latinos and Latinas have experienced, this kind of living between two cultures and not really feeling accepted or comfortable in either. So in San Antonio, Elizondo finds that he's a Mexican, he's a wetback, he's ostracized for that part of his identity. He's not quite American enough. But then he goes to Mexico, visit family, etc., and his Spanish isn't good enough. He's a gringo. Right? And so, two cultures, and yet at home in neither, or feeling a kind of double rejection. It reminds me of the line, a Puerto Rican poet, Roberto Bushwith cites it in his book, when asked, so he lived in New York, and when asked, where are you most comfortable, in New York or in Puerto Rico? And he said, on the plain in between. that place of alienation in between two cultures. If that's what Elizondo sees, what to make of it? How to judge it? As a Christian, Elizondo turns to the Bible, to the New Testament, to the person of Jesus. And he asks a question that seems kind of basic, but didn't seem to be asked much before him, and that is, what does it mean that Jesus is a Galilean? Galilee is a region towards the north of Israel. What does it mean for him to be Galilean? Much has been written on what it means for Jesus to be a human being. Christian notion of incarnation, God becoming human in the person of Jesus. Much has been invested in asking the question, was Jesus as a man? I won't go there right now. But to ask, what does it mean for Jesus to be a Galilean? One who, on the one hand, as a Galilean Jew, would have felt the stinging oppression of Roman conquerors and occupiers, yet at the same time, to an elite intelligentsia, say in a big city like Jerusalem, New York, seen as a rural town kid, not quite up to snuff, right? So the Galilean Jesus, for Elizondo, experiences the very double rejection that Elizondo sees in the U.S. Latino situation. And from that reading, he comes up with powerful notions, these principles, foremost among which is, he calls it the Galilean principle, that God loves what human beings reject. And that despite these double rejections, the message, the content of Jesus' ministry and his preaching is that God loves precisely what others reject, what human beings reject. And this serves as a way to ennoble, to give dignity to a people who have been marginalized. And that really has been a dramatic side of the story of U.S. Latina spirituality in the United States, is as a people who have claimed a dignity, though they are put on the margins. Economically, politically, socially, culturally, ecclesially, that is, within the church itself even, have been put on the margins, have been told they are not good enough, they cannot be leaders, etc. And so, this reading of the Gospels of one's faith serves to empower, to give dignity. And that is the action. We see that action in powerful ways. People gaining a voice. But in some ways, in the most unlikely of places. Because what Elizondo spends a good deal of time on is talking about devotional practices. Popular religious practices. Not official even practices, celebration of the Eucharist, that kind of thing, which are important of themselves. But having an altar at home home altar, different private devotions to saints, posadas, Dia de los Muertos, whatever the occasion or kinds of ritual celebrations are. Those actions, again, like the people themselves, have often been put, oh, that's superstition, or oh, that's silliness. But what Latino theologians have done is to say this is powerful. Something powerful is going on here. A powerful theology is being spoken here. Of contact with God, of what God finds to be beautiful and dignified. And so this retrieval is part of that, to see the power of that. I believe you read Professor Thetis and Alan Deck's article on spirituality, and there I'm bringing up the example of Cesar Chavez and the way the symbol, the image of the Virgen de Guadalupe is a powerful image. Devotion cuts across not just a religious act, but a way of being in the world, which is ultimately a way of being in the polis, city, politics. It's not easily separated out, but it's a way of being in the world, a spirituality. As this has been theorized by theologians, then, it is also a way to talk about acts of justice, like the boycott of the grapes was. We can also see more recently as well the work Adam Ockley, being from Florida, paid attention to the movement of migrant farm workers, and that has been a fascinating phenomenon. It has many resonances with the great boycott from San Joaquin Valley. But I'll return to that example because many college students were involved in that solidarity process. But to talk about action, talk about praxis, but also aesthetics, beauty, of the power of devotional practices as well. So, the spirituality then can be seen as one that embodies a preferential option for the poor. And again, the images that I would use, or the terms that I would use, are one that is empowering, that gives dignity. So maybe that might be a good place to pause, see if any feedback. I hate for this to be a monologue. Questions that you have about either what I've said about liberation theology or theology or spirituality. Does Elisondo's insight resonate for you? I mean, that living between two cultures. Anybody identify with that? Anyone courageous enough to say how they identify with that?
Well, just the same, like you said, like in Mexico, not Mexican, Latin, Sweden, so I think some people use stereotypes to have like children or Mexican, you know, give that full rejection.
Others? Yeah.
I definitely share the same experience where people will expect you to live a certain way, where they don't expect you to be able to speak English fluently, and that just because because I'm a young woman of a certain age and living in an urban environment, that people have expected me to have already started a family. I've been asked before by one of my mother's coworkers, "Oh, does she have kids?" I said, "No, I don't." And then when I hop over to Mexico, I still have similar challenges. It's like, oh, you're doing this, you're doing that, your Spanish isn't as clear as it really should be, and you have a strange accent, and it's just odd. Your values are completely different than ours. You don't really fit with us.
And I think subtext to both of your comments is the fascinating question of gender too, and gender roles, machismo in culture. Yeah.
I just want to say I've had a different experience. I think it's I guess I don't see it as difficult. It's a difference being that I didn't know English until maybe I was in first grade. My Spanish isn't bad. I don't have an accent, but I don't have a Mexican or Hispanic accent either. So I think I have more trouble here sometimes in certain areas. When I go home or
Can you talk about that? Here, in what area?
Well, I live south here, which is sometimes a little bit different from an urban environment where you can see more Hispanic. But still, I do live around an area where there are a lot of Hispanics, a lot of Mexicans. But you go a little south, there's just people who are still stereotypical, still racist, and it's different when you see some people saying something there, but I don't get as much in Mexico. Maybe it's because of the people where I go. I go to different places. My mom's side is Rancho, something where all the people know each other. But my dad's side is a city, urban environment. And you see, I see the differences, but I don't see any challenge in accommodating to it. Or I've never had anyone say anything to me about my Spanish or what my views are. I feel like I do understand a lot of that. I was interviewed once when I was in Mexico for some local TV station.
Oh, yeah.
For something about they were asking people what New Year's traditions they kept, whatever yellow, whatever, right? And they didn't notice anything different. They didn't say anything. I mean, it's just like they thought was just walking by. They asked everyone, and I've never had a challenge between like living and I can easily assimilate to the Mexican culture. I understand it. I know what they I do notice it sometimes with some people because when I go, there are people there that do look like who are married in an interracial couple and they don't know Spanish, and sometimes you feel a little bit more about them. Or, who is that? Why is he talking Spanish or why is he like that? And you do notice a little bit more when they don't know Spanish and they look a little bit whiter than or light skinned than the rest of the people there. But I've never had any difficulty, I guess, in cultural wise.
That kind of ties into what you were talking about, a Bulgarian. And my parents don't really, care that who I date or who I'm seeing. But like deep inside, my mom would marry a native girl. But my friend who's also Bulgarian, who's been here about the same time, he's dating a girl from Jamaica, and when they had the dinner with the parents, it went fine, but a couple of days later, like his dad told him, it's not okay for you to date other races. And he basically wanted him to stick to like European white. That's it. So it kind of ties in, but not with me.
Yeah.
I mean, like my parents, like they do tell my girlfriend, like, yeah, you should start learning Bulgarian, be good for you. Like they push it, but they don't really care.
Well, there has been a good deal of research now being generated and reflection done on this situation of generations beyond the immigrant generation, and how challenges continue, but I think also the possibilities expand as well. And so kind of need to think about those two. And if one were to do a kind of new seeding of the situation, there is that complexity of identity. I remember filling out even the census form. Nationality or cultural background, check the Puerto Rican box, my wife, check the Cuban box, our kids. Oops, know my mother-in-law would want Cuban. I don't think that would fly with my mom. There was no Puerto Rican Cuban American box. If you heard the line from the song, and this is the tie. Of course, Professor Peter sprung the song thing on me 10 minutes before we came over here. There's a line in that song, Carnaval del Barrio, that says, my mom is Dominican-Cuban, my dad is from Chile and PR, which means I'm Chile-Dominican-Rican. But I always say I'm from Queens. It's a wonderful line. And that can be a reality for many. Ironically, though, the sense of double rejection can stick around in a puzzling way. Its last generation, 30, 40 years, has done much to advance the cause, the place of Latinos and Latinas consciously in society as identity. We're not going anywhere. This is a people with dignity, etc. Sometimes that can turn into kind of frozen, reified form. I know colleagues of my own that have hastily had to hyphenate their names with Spanish last names. Right? My great-grandmother's last name was Gonzalez, so I'll throw it in there. Because I have to sound Latino. Sometimes the staunch defense of Latinidad, this identity over and against American oppressive culture, leaves Latinos and Latinas in a position where they kind of are self-loathing. Dimension of their very selves. If it is preservation of Latinidad in contrast to what Americans think or do, then for those of us born here, speaking English, enjoying American music, food, whatever the case may be, in addition to maybe our family's heritage, food, culture, etc., you're asked to make a choice. And the whole point is that you don't need to make a choice. A hybrid identity is exactly that. So it signals both the challenge but also the gift, the promise. The nickname that's been tossed around is to be a gente puente, a puente gente, a bridge people. That can negotiate across cultures and to live biculturally is an important lesson. Our world keeps shrinking and shrinking, as your comments made. And cultures, and those of us in a city like Chicago or New York know it by our blocks. Chicago is a little bit more neighborhood defined. We all stick in neighborhoods a little bit more. But anyway, we know the global richness now of cultures meeting and of multiple commitments and identities. Well, if that's the situation, and it's a situation that's interesting because to those who would say, well, Latinos and Latinas, they're just the latest immigrants. They'll assimilate. Let's give them a couple generations, and they'll assimilate just like whatever, Italian, Irish, you name it. And this includes culturally, but also within the church. That doesn't seem to be quite the case. In a recent study that the Pew Foundation did on Hispanic youth, 79% of second-generation Hispanic youth report speaking Spanish very or pretty well. Even 40% of the third generation continue to use the Spanish language. Over 50% listen to Spanish music in addition to music sung in English language. The possibilities of contemporary technology, as well as just the geographical proximity, means that this population, I think, cannot be simply fit into an assimilationist mold or box. But if that's a seeing, then what's the judging? If Elizondo went to the Galilean Jesus, what image, what notion, a figure might we turn to? Well, as a kind of preliminary glance, I wanted to look at a character from the New Testament, Nicodemus, particularly how he functions in the Gospel of John. Now, I need to turn this screen on, so what am I hitting?
Black screen.
No, I think you're doing it. Thank you so much. The way that I can go. The character Nicodemus first appears in the 3rd chapter of the Gospel of John. There was a man of the Pharisees named Nicodemus, a ruler of the Jews. This man came to Jesus by night and said to him, Rabbi, we know that you are a teacher come from God, for no one can do these signs that you do unless God is with you. And Jesus answers, truly I say to you, unless one is born, and the Greek term there is anothet, which has 2 definitions. It can be understood as again or from above. John is using pun here, play on words. You cannot see the kingdom of God. Nicodemus said to him, how can a man be born when he's old? Right? So he strictly understands it from his first meeting. Again, can he enter a second time into his mother's womb and be born? Jesus answers, truly, truly, I say to you, unless one is born of water and the Spirit, he cannot enter the kingdom of God. Later on, just a couple verses down, Jesus says the wind or spirit, pneuma is the Greek term. Again, a double word that plays on a pun. Blows where it chooses, and you hear the sound of it, but you do not know where it comes from or where it goes. So it is with everyone who is born of the pneuma, of the wind or spirit. Nicodemus is ignorant in this passage. He doesn't seem to comprehend the play on words that's happening. He takes a literal meaning to Jesus' words and doesn't quite get what's going on, so that some scholars have dismissed him as a bad character. Nicodemus is an example, but you don't want to be. Ignorant, lacking faith. Other characters, Samaritan woman at the well, or someone like that embodies a faith that confesses Jesus. But I think there's something about the ambiguity of his character that is really interesting. First of all, he seeks out Jesus. He comes to him. He comes to him at night. Now for some, that's a symbolism of ignorance, darkness, night. But it could also be read as in secret, as in it's dangerous for Nicodemus to be seeking out Jesus. So he does so on the sly, under the cover of night, because it's dangerous. Why would he risk that? Why would he involve that danger to come see him? And he does acknowledge that he comes from God. Now, comes from God is a bit a lower level than other confessions of Jesus that are going to happen in this gospel. But it's a positive one. Well, he appears a second time in the 7th chapter of John. We see Nicodemus who had gone to Jesus before, and who was one of them. The Pharisees said to them, does our law judge a man without first giving him a hearing and learning what he does? This group of rulers had just scolded Roman soldiers for not bringing Jesus in. They asked him to arrest him. Nicodemus makes this intervention, and the response is, are you from Galilee too? Search and you will see that no prophet is to rise from Galilee. What's going on here? Is Nicodemus arguing a point of law? Is he trying to open up a space where Jesus is going to be received and be heard? What happens, more importantly, to him when he makes this intervention? What's the cost to him? He one of them. Galilean pipes. Right? So he takes on personal kind of accusation and the finger pointing of that type. You see maybe a deepening here, the boldness of Nicodemus to speak at all. The last and final appearance of Nicodemus then is after the death of Jesus. He appears with Joseph of Arimathea, who was a disciple of Jesus, identified as such, but secretly, again, secretly, for fear of the Jews. He asked Pilate that he might take away the body of Jesus, and Pilate gave him leave. So he came and took away his body. Nicodemus also, who had at first come to him by night, came bringing a mixture of myrrh and aloes, about 100 pounds weight. They took the body of Jesus, bound it in linen cloth and spices, as is the burial custom of the Jews. An interesting moment. For some scholars, it's just an extension of the ignorance that Nicodemus has shown all along. Who do you bury with 100 pounds weight of myrrh and aloes? Only kings. Ordinary people don't think that can happen. Much less a criminal who just got capital punishment. You don't bury a guy like that. They're very expensive. Fragrances and spices. Myrrh and aloes. So some say, well, here he is, ignorant once again. Trying to bury a king, but the wrong kind of king. He doesn't get it. I don't know that I agree with that position. Both of these characters come before Pilate. A guy who killed Jesus. The Roman power who has the authority to do the execution of crucifixion. Asking for the body of this man. That's vulnerability before the emperor. And there's something subversive here. The one you mocked, right? The mockery of Jesus at his death as King of the Jews. But his king, his identity as king is being affirmed here. The rival king, not Caesar, is being affirmed here and buried properly. There's a boldness, though not ambiguous place. But again, vulnerability before ultimate political power. What might this figure Nicodemus here do in light of this reflection? Well, I think first of all that it's that ambiguity of place, right? That really captures again that sense of living between cultures. But it really poses some challenging questions as well. What are the set of practices, communal ties, that might be meaningful after a reflection like this? Ecclesial structures. What does one have as a resource to go to? In a time where those resources might seem to be vanishing. Well, perhaps before answering those questions, we might take a brief look back at liberation theology. I said it inspired the first generation of thought, and I think there's a relevant way in which it inspires again another response. Can I take as examples from my study on the situation in El Salvador? And I would have us reflect on three people or groups of people. The first are four Americans. Jean Donovan, Eda Ford, Mark Clark, and Dorothy Kazel. Three of them were religious women. Two were Ursuline nuns, the other a Maryknoll. And the fourth, Jean, was a laywoman. But they worked with communities in El Salvador in the late 1970s. And in December of 1980, they were kidnapped, raped, and murdered. To read Jean Donovan's diary is an unbelievable thing. Anna Kerrigan, in her book Salvador Witness, titles two of the chapters towards the end, Diary of a Nightmare. And it's unbelievable to read the events, the experiences that these brave women went through as the country was falling apart, literally falling apart and just rolling towards civil war. These courageous women stayed with these communities, accompanied them, often transporting people under the guise of safety because there was more respect paid to North Americans. Monsignor Urioste was a close friend. The next figure we'll talk about, Archbishop Oscar Romero, talks about the last time he saw these women. They gave him a ride. He said that he joked, it's nice to drive around with a North American woman. I know I'm a little bit safer. Well, that ministry of accompaniment, accompanying women and children who had to leave their homes, to flee their homes, or be killed. That is a real preferential option. Jean Donovan was engaged to be married. She went to a wedding in Ireland where she had done some school. Friends of hers, her fiancé, asked her, please, don't go back to El Salvador. She said, I know. I'd like to, but I have to go back. All I see are faces, women and children that I work with, and I ask, who else is going to leave? How can I leave them behind? Her heart had really been given to this population. And that commitment is a powerful witness. Archbishop Oscar Romero, who was Archbishop of San Salvador from 1977 to his assassination in March of 1980, not only demonstrates a personal commitment, but an institutional one as well, specifically of his archdiocese and of its attempt to stand with those people who were being abused, whose any efforts to improve their lot were met with horrific repression. And although it took place in many forms, one of the interesting ways was his use of liturgy, of Eucharist. I just recently had a former priest from that period in El Salvador, Chencho, who founded some of the first-based communities in El Salvador, talked to me once about how 14 teachers who had organized a union and a strike were arrested. And those ways to be arrested probably meant to be tortured and disappeared, executed. And there was panic. And they came to him, what are we going to do? And he said, let's have a mass. Let's have a mass right in front of the jail. So he was giving a retreat, and all the retreatants dispersed to their communities, ringing their church bells, which was a sign that something important was going on. And in a matter of hours, they had a crowd of over 1,500, close to 2,000 people gathered to celebrate Mass in front of this jail. Yes, it was a religious, liturgical celebration, but at the same time, it was a gathering of people to voice their opposition, and quite frankly, it is what saved these teachers' lives. They were released the next day. Too much celebration. When he first came to office as Archbishop, Romero had there was a Jesuit priest who was murdered around March 77. Romero called for one Mass, a funeral Mass, as the only Mass in the country that day. Anyone who wanted to participate in the Mass had to go to that funeral, had to listen to that funeral Mass on the radio. Many were very opposed. This is making faith a political statement. Right? This is this is getting involved in politics. Because at the same time, Romero also boycotted the new president's inauguration ceremony. He said, until something is done about why this priest was murdered, I can't go to the inauguration. And to the responses, more importantly, those who say, you're making faith political, he asked, well, what was going on when the bishop attended on a presidential inauguration? What kind of a statement is already being made with the bishop there at an inauguration? So for remember, the question was not a if politics and lived faith, but the how. Too often, silence is an action already. It's complicit. Finally, in November of 1989, 6 Jesuit priests, their housekeeper and her daughter, were assassinated on the lawn of the UCA, Central American University. Among them was the president, Rector Ignacio Ellacuría, the head of the Department of Social Psychology, Ignacio Ellacuría, and the sociologist, Segundo Montes. Now, each of their biographies are something that could be done for a whole presentation, if not semester. But why I bring them today as an example is that they were university people, and you in the university community understand the power of knowledge, of study. And for them, they called it, in addition to teaching and research, the mission of their university included social projection. So that the focus of their research, their study, their papers, their analyses, their journals, was on what they call the national reality, what was going on. Ignacio Ellacuría taught Jesuit seminarians who were eager to get out in the field, get with the people. What are we doing in a classroom, they asked. He responded to them, we do our work en un escritorio, pero no desde un escritorio. We do our work in a desk, but not from a desk. But the commitment to social projection, to the historical reality of oppressed peoples, meant a way to orient studies, a way to make the literature count, to matter. And for those who are skeptical or cynical about what do academics matter, it was clear on the night he was assassinated, these soldiers elected to choose a symbolism of firing at Ellacuría's brains. That is what God did. Well, much more can be said. But I wonder if we can't take a few themes. The New Testament in the book of Philippians talks about kenosis. It's about the incarnation, God becoming human in the person of Jesus. Though he was in the form of God, he did not count equality with God something to be grasped at. Rather, he emptied, verb here is kenosis, taking the form of a slave. The moment Nicodemus before Pilate can be a moment of kenosis, of emptying oneself. For Ellacuría and the others, it was to put the university and empty itself into this reality, not taking prestige and power as a given, not doing things in a kind of university way, adopting its privileges first, but in self-emptying. Latina theology in its first generation was an empowering one, and it continues to be. But in another way, for another generation that has reached success, unprecedented success. Latinos and Latinas are in boardrooms, are successful on the Supreme Court. And so, along with empowering dignity, there can also be this disempowering, in a sense, kenosis. That the call of privilege and of power is a responsibility that needs to be an essential part of Latino and Latina spirituality. and in there an example to all people. In the Encuentro documents produced in terms of Hispanic ministry and the National Plan for Hispanic Ministry that talks about seguimiento. Following of Jesus is an essential in Christian spirituality. Ellacuría used to talk about seguimiento and proseguimiento. And if you add that prefix, the verb changes from following to carrying forward. Following Jesus means carrying forward of what Jesus did in his ministry. Sharing meals with those who are marginalized. Proclaiming good news to those who have not heard. This needs to continue today. Seguimiento, proseguimiento. What does it mean to be a follower of Jesus in the most powerful nation on earth? How can we view Latino or Latina success while still resisting tokenism? What might it mean then to both reject the kind of racist messages of inferiority that a culture often presupposes or that experience in this society is often meant, without resorting to these categories that worsen divisions? How do we overcome these oppositions? At the end of the Gospels, followers are called to return to Galilee. And I think in many ways, to return to Galilee, I use this image of being raised in Jerusalem. To return to Galilee is to return to many of these insights of the first generation. For many, it might be a return to the cultural roots of parents and grandparents. In a Christian sense, the return to Galilee is the return to the start of Jesus' ministry, and of course, his ministry was the journey to Jerusalem. A happy journey in some sense, where it meant death. So this is in the case of these Salvadoran witnesses, it meant their deaths. Let me conclude just by saying that return to Galilee and that journey, though it might end in death, might mean crucifixion for some, it is also filled with the hope that, like Jesus, will be raised in Jerusalem. So, thank you. Thank you for your time. Questions? Comments? Anything? Stunned silence.
So about 5 years ago, when I first was exposed to Latin American theology and liberation theology,
Sure.
so I'm actually Indian, but I really remember being inspired by this. And I think actually it was just a required course, but it actually probably changed the direction of my life. But because the thing was, it inspired me because it really gave me a language to understand what it means to be, a first generation, second generation immigrant, or a child of an immigrant here. But I think my question is, how do you take important concepts from Latin American theology and apply it to other cultural situations where, especially in our situation, I realize the obstacles are that, the dominant culture often recognizes Indians as either Hindu or Muslim, so we have to deal with that. And then we're Eastern Catholic, and that's not recognized as much. And then, I had another one, but I can't remember. But a third obstacle, but what are some important aspects that we can sort of learn from Latin American theology and apply to other contexts?
Well, let me say, first of all, that process has really occurred so that to talk about liberation theologies today is really to talk about global liberation theologies. To talk about African liberation theologies and Asian liberation theologies. I was in a meeting in Belgium a year or two ago and met a few theologians from Sri Lanka who are operating in this context of interreligious with Hindu and Muslim, and even the phenomenon of Dalit theology going beyond Christianity. So it's interreligious, it is global. So I think that influence is possible, is already spoken to by the vibrancy of liberation theologies around the world. As far as insights go, well, there are many. I chose, even just to see my talk, I tried to find a few, to really think about how to enact the See, Judge, Act methodology in one's own context. To think about, well, what does a phrase like preferential option mean now in my situation, in our collective situation? These are some key insights, but I don't think that they're restricted there. There's a complexity with which we live now, and maybe the one thing that I'm wrestling with right now is growing up and living in a consumer culture. Vince Miller and some others have written kind of persuasively on this, and asking, like, when we talk about spirituality and practices, one of the things that conditions us most is our consuming, technology. We, by the very location we're in and anything we own, are tied into our global economy in a certain way. So there's economic issues. But also at the level of how things are received. For Latinos and Latinas, there's this rich cultural reservoir of practices and so on and so forth. But in a consumer culture where things are just kind of bought, cafeteria style, it's easy to think about certain practices. Oh, I like that, or I'll put one of those in my backyard. I like a Zen garden. And you kind of pick and choose and fashion spiritual and collect spiritual commodities that are ultimately divorced from their traditions, from the things that gave them meaning. Living in New York right now and being Puerto Rican, I see a Puerto Rican population that has lost its geographical center. El Barrio is no longer there. It's kind of there. It's mostly Dominican now, not Puerto Rican. Where is the neighborhood or the family, or what are those institutions and places where tradition stuff keeps going on and gives meaning to these profound, tradition and devotions and so on and so forth? Because they just become a grab bag of things that I shop for. Then you get cut off from its lifeblood. They just become things. So that's one of the application things that I'm really struggling and trying to think through at this time. Any other questions, thoughts?
Association being commercialized, what aspects do you think how big preventing that? Just the knowledge of the traditions themselves?
No, not well. How one gains that knowledge? It's how does that get rooted? And also trying to capture the possibilities. I mean, Catholic Church in the United States has this long legacy. For instance, the national parishes. Well, those have kind of gone by the wayside. But now people are asking, what about parishes in and of themselves? What does it mean to have some of your best friends on Facebook, where I'm in contact more with friends who are California or Arizona or El Salvador, and through Facebook I know that their kids didn't sleep last night. I know that Johnny had an infection last week. I know that they had a great party the week before that. I'm not cynical at all about this. I mean, there's a richness. I saw a friend that I hadn't seen in a year. And we didn't have to do all the catch-up talk because we're Facebook friends. I know now more about his life than I did when I lived in the same city as him. The question, though, is, as a community, as people of a religious tradition, how do you generate a sense of community that was kind of given when a small community all attended the same church, familial, grandparents and grandparents or mothers and fathers were right there, sometimes in the same house. When that disappears, what are the other possibilities? Is social media one of them? I don't know. It seems to be one. I don't know if you recall, but this was 2 Christmases ago. There was a horrible mass murder in Miami. A guy came to a Christmas celebration, must have been Thanksgiving, and took out a gun and shot family members. It was a horrible tragedy. 2 of the women that were killed were high school classmates of my wife's. What was amazing to me was, in the subsequent weeks, Facebook became a place of sharing stories about these women, of consolation, of real mutual support, of friends from around the country. I was astonished. Up until that time, I'm like, well, Facebook, my wife, always on the Facebook. And then I saw something very powerful occur. Now, they also decided to meet back in Miami, where they all went to high school together and had a liturgy and so on. I'm not saying electronic social media replaces human contact, but it shouldn't be seen in complete isolation. So, in terms of your commercial question, I mean, there's a way in which things are commercialized and advertised, and those things are things that are challenges, but at the same time, there are opportunities as well. Just about at our time, but in temperature. Well, thank you again.